It was one of the worst medical scandals ever to affect this country.
Effectively handed my community of people a death sentence.
And tonight we can tell the heartbreaking story of how 56 youngsters from one Hampshire school lost their lives because of a treatment that was supposed to save them.
I think there are lots of people who have no idea of the scale of what happened and have no idea of the scale of the suffering it caused.
Now their relatives say the government kept them in the dark, and it's time the truth came out.
They did know it was there. They're just taking chances. Chance too many, I think.
John Peach lost both his sons in their 20s. Lee was 27 when he died, Jason just 23. They were born with haemophilia, but they were given AIDS by a treatment designed to improve their quality of life.
It was completely different characters. You know, Jason was a bit of a clown, and Lee was the more serious type. He wanted a really good career. He was into his music, he was into his graphic designing, he used to travel, married an American girl. Really gone very well. All he wanted to do was live a normal life, which he could have done, without a doubt.
John's sons were given infected blood products in the 1970s and early 80s, clotting factors that were imported and used widely to treat haemophiliacs in Britain, but which carried deadly viruses.
I was there with Lee when he died, and you can't understand that he's not going to live. Then all of a sudden the machine packs up and it's finished. You know, people try and explain it to you and you say, no, it's not right, something's wrong. I felt bloody helpless that day, I tell you. Just shows you how insignificant you can become. You really can. Yeah. But who's responsible? Would be nice to know.
Lee and Jason Peach were students here at the Lord Mayor Treloar College at Alton. Treloar's has led the way in the education of disabled youngsters for almost 100 years. One group who are particularly well remembered are the boys with haemophilia. Tonight we can reveal how this tight-knit group of friends was torn apart by a tragedy which killed more than 50 of them, many before they reached their 30th birthdays.
In the 1960s, Treloar Hospital had a specialist haemophilia centre to treat the debilitating bleeding disorder which mainly affects boys. Parents of haemophiliacs from all over Britain started sending their sons to Treloar College, where there were children with a wide range of physical disabilities. It became so popular that in the mid-70s, the NHS centre moved to the college to treat its young patients on site. Jane Price worked there as a nurse.
Unlike in hospitals where patients come and go, obviously, you really got to know both the outpatients and the boys that were actually here because you were seeing them over a long period of time. And we weren't just involved in the treatment. We used to do, as I say, go on holiday with them. I used to swim with them, play volleyball with them. So the staff were very involved with them and with their care. So I think it's very hard indeed.
Chris Hodgson was one of dozens of outpatients who were also treated at the centre. Fortunately, Chris was one of those not infected with HIV. He is now chairman of the Haemophilia Society. There are usually around 5,000 haemophiliacs in Britain. In the 1970s and 80s, a third were infected with HIV, the AIDS virus.
I think personally it is probably an untold story of one of the greatest medical disasters that has ever been. It was like an evolving nightmare almost, you know. I mean, it went on, and it was clearly accelerating. So the effect on you was enormous, and I'm sure the effect on the people who were treating us was equally as enormous.
Historically, haemophilia was untreatable in most cases until the mid-70s, when a new treatment was developed. Clotting factors were extracted from the blood of donors. Staff at the NHS centre at Treloar were at the forefront of the new development, which revolutionised the boys' lives.
One injection would almost be a cure, and it was a complete transformation of your life. You almost felt like a normal person, you know. The problem of haemophilia was almost beaten.
But demand for the blood products far outstripped the national supply. The product was called Factor VIII. Most of it was being imported from America. Unlike European donors, American donors were paid for their blood by drug companies, an incentive that was attracting prostitutes, drug users and alcoholics. The American drug companies were warned, but they continued to use blood from these so-called Skid Row donors. In Britain, doctors became concerned that viruses were creeping into these products. No one knew then the deadly danger being carried in the blood. Dr. Mark Winter has worked with haemophiliacs for more than 20 years.
We made representations to the Department of Health and said, this is not a good idea to be importing commercial blood from the United States. Because of this hepatitis evidence, we knew nothing of AIDS. Because of this evidence, why don't we have our own plant in Britain which would enable Britain to be self-sufficient? And those representations were made in 1975 and 1976.
And Dr. David Owen, who was then the Health Secretary, promised the doctors that Britain would only be using blood from this country by the end of 1977.
When I made the decision now, some time ago, it was thought that it would take us 3 years. We brought it down to 2 years, and maybe we can improve even on that.
In fact, Britain never became self-sufficient in blood products. Governments, both Labour and Conservative, continued to import Factor VIII. The benefits were deemed to outweigh any possible risks. Then, in 1985, the haemophilia community was hit by a bombshell.
We've had 3 cases of AIDS in this city. A further haemophiliac has died of AIDS since then. I have 1 further patient with full-blown AIDS, and 20% of my patients show some form of physical abnormality which could be attributed to AIDS.
In Newcastle, a doctor told journalists that his patients were dying from a disease that had been causing alarm in the gay community and among haemophiliacs in America. 19-year-old Andrew Beasley saw the press conference on TV. He was a haemophiliac who'd been to Treloar College. Now he knew he might have the AIDS virus. Andrew died last year. At 32, he was one of the older ones. His wife Amanda remembers.
He was quite naturally devastated, but didn't know what to do about it, didn't know who to talk to about it, so I think he really bottled up his worries about it until quite some time later.
It wasn't until he'd met Amanda that Andrew shared his fears and he went for an HIV test.
We were told very little. All we knew was that it would be a life-threatening illness, and the chances were that Andrew wouldn't survive more than 2 years.
Amanda and Andrew decided to get married as soon as possible and make the most of what time they had together.
We knew we couldn't have a family, and that was really difficult for Andrew and I think for many other people. So it just turned our lives upside down, and it meant we couldn't plan for anything. And, you know, we were always worried that Andrew might become ill because we didn't know how the illness would come about either. You know, with HIV you can become ill in so many ways, and we never knew what it would be.
At the Haemophilia Centre at Treloar, staff were beginning to realise how seriously some of their young patients would be affected.
I think initially, we didn't quite know how it was all going to affect them, how ill they would become, and what nature that illness, what nature it would take, really. But yes, it gradually did become quite clear that the future, the rosy future that they'd been given with having Factor VIII was suddenly going to be taken away from them.
Caddy Cudderbucks from Brighton was diagnosed as HIV positive around the same time. He had been to Treloar in the 60s. He's one of the few haemophiliacs who became infected but who's still alive.
I myself just tried to bury my head in the sand and not look at it at all. But eventually I did. And then I found out that nobody wanted to know about it. It was like a dirty disease. It was stigmatizing. And including the haemophilia population, the ones that weren't infected didn't want to know about it either, because they were indirectly stigmatized just by saying that they were haemophiliac, even if they didn't have HIV, were stigmatized by it. Their children at school were told, we don't want you here, or things like that.
2 years ago, Caddy himself nearly died from pneumonia. But he's found the best way for him to deal with the disease is to come out fighting.
The way I confronted it was by, first of all, not allowing it to be a shameful disease, but I wasn't ashamed to mention it to anybody I met. And secondly, I would always do interviews and expose myself regardless of whether it affected people around me.
But it was only over the next 10 years that the Treloar boys realised the depth of the crisis, and they learned in the most terrible way.
Suddenly, one person you knew died. Maybe you expected that, and then another, and then another. And slowly the whole situation began to accelerate. And of course it was at that time that the Haemophilia Society realised the problem, and the Haemophilia Society started its campaign for financial assistance, compensation, recompense, call it what you will, for those people infected with HIV.
In 1987, the government released £10 million to set up a hardship fund. Over the next 3 years, those with HIV received a further payment and an out-of-court settlement that in most cases was less than £25,000. They were all asked to sign a waiver, promising they would never again bring any legal proceedings should any other viruses be identified at a later date. Many of them had reservations, but they signed.
When the settlement was made, we felt we had no option but to take what was offered, because we didn't think that Andrew would live long enough for there to be you know, a long drawn-out legal case, really, and we didn't want to be involved in a long fight anyway. It was much more important to get on with living what life we had together.
The solicitors said to the boys, look, we've only got until a certain date. If only one of your 1,200 does not sign, then nobody gets anything.
So it was almost like an emotional blackmail. It was an emotional blackmail.
By then, a new technique to heat-treat blood and kill the viruses had been developed. Many of those who were infected felt they were forgotten.
The haemophiliac community had been decimated by HIV infection, but there were other threats to their lives lurking in the blood products that they received.
It wasn't just the boys from Treloar who were suffering. In the last 15 years, across the country, more than 800 haemophiliacs have lost their lives. An icon stands in the church of St Botolph's without Bishopsgate in London to commemorate the dead. Every year, more names are added to the Book of Remembrance. In the 90s, a second blow was dealt to the community. A nameless virus that doctors back in the 1970s had feared was being spread by contaminated blood products was finally identified. It was another killer, HCV, or hepatitis C, which can take up to 20 years to develop. Colette Wintle from Tunbridge Wells is one of few women who suffer from haemophilia. Colette was given hepatitis C and a clotting factor when she was a teenager.
Physical effects of having the illness, they're appalling. You're looking at fatigue, nausea, bone ache, muscle ache, depression. All of those things are the physical side of it, but the psychological side of it. Let me put it this way. When one wakes in the morning with it in your mind, how long have I got, and you go to bed thinking the same thing, and it's day in, day out, it doesn't go away.
Although Colette was infected at the same time as those with HIV, she's never received any money from the government. In fact, the majority of haemophiliacs with HIV were also infected with hepatitis C. But because that hadn't been officially identified when the financial settlement was made, no money was allocated to help sufferers cope with this second infection. And because haemophiliacs had signed a waiver promising never to bring another legal action, they were cut off from receiving any further financial support.
I think it's very sad that the hepatitis C affected patients have been left out of this argument. The fact is there was absolutely no difference at all in the way in which haemophiliacs were infected with AIDS or HCV. They were all given through contaminated blood product, and it was basically a roulette as to, well, did you get both or did you get one or other? Both of them deserve proper compensation. Both of them deserve full support.
Andrew Beasley and those of his friends from Treloar who had been infected didn't expect to live for more than 2 years. The longer they lived, the more they realised the government handout was far too small. It meant when Andrew was dying, Amanda couldn't give up work to nurse him.
Well, it didn't seem like compensation in any sense of the word, really. You know, it in no way compensated for Andrew's lack of earnings, let alone the suffering that he was to go through. It didn't buy us any security, really, which we had hoped for. We'd just hoped that it would be enough to buy a property so that we wouldn't have to worry about accommodation, that we'd always have somewhere to live that was secure. But it was nowhere near enough for that.
Last Christmas, the Haemophilia Society laid more than 100 lilies at number 10, each representing someone who'd died from hepatitis C. Meanwhile, another former pupil of Treloar College has been granted legal aid to contest the waiver. Many suspect the government knew of the dangers of hepatitis C when it asked sufferers to promise not to take any further legal action.
I think they did know, and they wouldn't have put it in the waiver if they didn't know. They would have just left it a blank space there. But they knew perfectly well there are other hepatitis viruses around that were in the blood transfusion system.
I think this is one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the NHS, and yet there's been no official inquiry or report has ever been carried out.
Last month, Poole's Conservative MP Robert Sims raised the Society's plea for a public inquiry and financial help for those infected with hepatitis C. But the government hasn't moved from its original position, even though when in opposition, the Health Secretary Alan Milburn and Health Minister and Southampton MP John Denham signed an early-day motion supporting the call for an investigation. Both refused to be interviewed. But a Department of Health spokesman expressed the government's regret at the level of infection and said,
"As soon as the technology became available to make blood products free from hepatitis C, the NHS introduced it. All of the information is in the public domain, and the government does not believe it is in anyone's interest to hold a public inquiry."
But it's galling for haemophiliacs to see so many others awarded large amounts of compensation and other tragedies fully investigated when their calls for financial support fall on deaf ears.
How interesting that they're so keen to compensate on moral grounds the BSE-infected victims and happy for a public inquiry. Why not us? Why have they left us out? Why have they consistently ignored us for so long?
And John Peach, who lost both his sons, believes there was a cover-up.
They issue all the licences to where this stuff's coming from. It got into the system, the same as this BSE's got into the system. You know, and that somebody's not doing the job somewhere. And it wouldn't be so bad if they actually put their hands up and apologised and said, look, we're awfully sorry, this is what went wrong. But they cover their own backs every single time.
Next week, Chris Hodgson and members of the Haemophilia Society are meeting with health ministers. They say important questions still need to be answered.
The government have said that it was the best possible treatment available to them. If they didn't have the treatment, it was a life-threatening illness, and therefore they had to receive the treatment. I think we accept that. We realise that people needed to receive the treatment. But what has happened is, of course, that the products that we use, the factor concentrates that we used, was enough care taken about importing these products, the use of those products, where the donors had come from. Knowledge of that was known for a long time before much action was taken.
It's always easy looking back, isn't it? But you have to say, looking at the experience of other countries who did make a decision to become self-sufficient, that the evidence was there to make that informed decision, and that, you know, another government would have made that decision in this country to say, this is not a good idea.
And the families of those who died say an independent inquiry is the least their loved ones deserve. Andrew Beasley and Lee Peach died without seeing anyone take responsibility for what happened.
He was angry about it, He didn't actually get bitter about it, but he was angry, and he said to me just a few weeks before he died he felt he'd been cheated, and I think that was his main feeling, that he'd been cheated out of his life.
I actually found a tape that he'd left to his young wife, Andrea, in the last few days that he taped in hospital, and he was starting to get a bit bitter then, because he knew that, you know, within 2 or 3 days he wasn't going to come out of there then. He'd virtually given up, I think, then.
Well, I try not to waste too much energy on feeling angry about it. I feel very sad about what's happened, obviously.
The Peach brothers and Andrew Beasley were part of a group of students at Treloar College who are fondly remembered by staff. And whenever there's a reunion, those involved with the Haemophilia Centre notice the absent faces the most.
You sort of look around the room to see who's there and who isn't there, and I must admit I'm a bit of a coward in that, you know, I sort of tend to sort of look rather than ask, and just wait to be told, because it is difficult, really.
Haemophiliacs are no longer treated at Treloar. The centre has moved, and children with the condition can now attend mainstream schools. The college is now one of the leading further education establishments for training youngsters with severe disabilities.
Although the NHS Centre has moved and many of today's staff and students have never met the boys with haemophilia, they remain a small group who will never be forgotten. Youngsters given hope by a new treatment only to have it completely dashed, and whose questions about why it happened have never fully been answered.
I would like to know who made the decisions which allowed this epidemic to occur, particularly amongst the haemophiliac community.
I think that's all anybody wanted, just the truth.
It just doesn't seem right that all those men were affected and so many have died, and there hasn't been any inquiry into what happened.